The hand-stitched patchwork quilt sat on the faded oak kitchen table, its edges carefully lined with thick red ribbon. 70-year-old Eleanor Vance smoothed out the last wrinkle with her calloused, steady hand, placing a small card on top that read, "To David, Patricia, and my sweet Chloe, Merry Christmas with all my love." She picked up the roll of tape, but before she could cut a piece, her phone on the counter began to hum against the formica. The caller ID flashed with her son's name, David. Eleanor smiled, wiping her hands on her apron as she pressed the speakerphone button. "Merry Christmas Eve, David. I was just finishing up wrapping your quilt. I managed to get the star patterns just the way Patricia liked." There was a long, uncomfortable silence on the other end of the line. The heavy hum of a vacuum cleaner ran in the background, followed by the faint sound of high heels clicking on hardwood floors. "Mom, hey," David's voice came through, sounding tense, clipped, and unnaturally fast. "Look, I'm glad I caught you. Patricia and I have been going over the schedule for tomorrow night's dinner, and, well, we ran into a bit of a logistical nightmare." Eleanor set the tape down, her blue eyes narrowing slightly as she pulled out a wooden chair and sat down. "A nightmare? Is the catering delayed, son?" No, the catering is fine," David stammered, clearing his throat loudly. In the background, his wife Patricia's voice carried clearly across the line. "David, tell her now before the decorators get here." David let out a sharp, exhaled breath. "Mom, look, Patricia's boss, Mr. Harrington, the CEO of Sterling Defense, accepted our invitation to Christmas Eve dinner. He's bringing 3 executive board members. It's a massive deal for my career. If this dinner goes well, I'm looking at the senior vice president position by January." "That's wonderful news, David," Eleanor said softly, keeping her tone even. "I know how hard you've worked for that company." "Right, exactly," David rushed on, his words tumbling over each other like loose gravel. "So, because of that, the house is going to be extremely crowded. We have servers coming in, high-profile guests, and the whole main floor is set up with formal cocktail tables. And, well, Patricia brought up a good point. With your walker and the 5 steps up to the front porch and needing to sit near a quiet bathroom, it's just going to be really complicated, Mom. It's a lot of physical hassle for you, and honestly, it's just too much trouble to manage with everything else going on." The room seemed to grow cold. Eleanor sat frozen, her hand resting on the edge of the handmade quilt. She could hear her own heart beating slow and steady in her chest. "Too much trouble?" Eleanor repeated quietly. "You know what I mean, Mom?" David snapped, his defensiveness instantly flaring up. "Don't make this dramatic. You know how fast-paced these corporate events are. You get tired by 7 o'clock. You don't know any of these high-society people. You'd just end up sitting in the corner feeling out of place while we're trying to entertain international executives. We think it's much better for everyone if you just stay home, relax, and have a quiet evening." "David?" Eleanor started, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been looking forward to seeing Chloe open her present all month. I haven't seen my granddaughter since Thanksgiving." "We'll bring you leftovers on Boxing Day, Mom," David said, his voice dropping into that hurried, patronizing tone he used when he wanted to end a conversation. "Chloe has a full schedule anyway. Look, I have to go. The ice sculpture company just pulled up the driveway. We'll call you on Christmas morning, okay? Love you. Bye." The line went dead with a sharp electronic click. Eleanor sat alone in the quiet kitchen. The winter sun was beginning to set outside her window, casting long gray shadows across her small backyard. She didn't cry. She didn't throw anything. She simply sat there in the silence, listening to the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Slowly, she reached out and touched the soft cotton of the quilt she had spent 3 months sewing. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a small, worn brass key. She walked slowly into her bedroom, her silver cane tapping against the hardwood floor. She reached beneath her bed and pulled out a heavy, dark mahogany lockbox that had remained unopened for nearly 15 years. What David didn't know, what his shallow, ambitious wife Patricia had never bothered to ask, was that Eleanor Vance's quiet life in this modest house was not the result of a simple, unremarkable existence. And as Eleanor turned the brass key in the lockbox, revealing a faded set of dog tags and a heavily decorated olive drab uniform jacket, she stared at the gold oak leaf cluster pinned to the lapel, wondering how her only son had grown up to be a stranger. The sun rose on Christmas Eve morning over the gated community of Oak Ridge Estates, painting the multi-million-dollar mansions in a crisp, white blanket of fresh snow. Inside David Vance's 6,000-square-foot home, the air smelled of fresh pine, expensive cinnamon candles, and high-strung panic. Patricia Vance, dressed in a silk robe, rushed through the grand foyer holding an iPad in one hand and a glass of warm lemon water in the other. She was directing 3 uniformed caterers who were carrying silver trays toward the dining room. "No, no, no!" Patricia barked, waving her iPad frantically at a young waiter. "The floral arrangements go on the perimeter tables. The center table is strictly reserved for Mr. Harrington and his board members. I want zero clutter on the main line." David walked down the floating glass staircase, tying the belt of his cashmere sweater. He looked pale, his eyes darting toward the front door every time a car passed on the street. "Patricia, did you make sure the driveway was salted again?" David asked nervously, pouring himself a cup of black coffee from the marble kitchen island. "Mr. Harrington's driver is using a commercial sedan. If he slips on our driveway, the whole deal is dead." "The driveway is pristine, David," Patricia said, adjusting her pearl earrings in the hall mirror. "Unlike your mother's house, this property is properly maintained." 16-year-old Chloe stepped into the kitchen, wearing a simple wool sweater and holding her phone. She looked around the cavernous, white marble room, her eyebrows pulling together in confusion. "Mom?" Chloe asked, looking at the extra place settings being laid out by the staff. "Where is Grandma's chair going? Is she sitting with us at the main table or near the fireplace?" Patricia didn't even turn around. "Your grandmother isn't coming tonight, Chloe." Chloe froze, her phone slipping an inch in her hand. "What? Why? She's been talking about Christmas Eve dinner for 6 weeks. She made me that custom stocking." "Chloe, don't start," David interrupted, stepping in front of his daughter with a stern look. "Your mother and I made an executive decision. Tonight is a critical night for the family's financial future. Mr. Harrington is a very serious, high-profile corporate titan. Grandma is old-fashioned. She moves slowly, she gets confused, and having her walker clattering around while caterers are carrying $500 wine bottles is a safety hazard." "A safety hazard," Chloe repeated, her voice rising in disbelief. "She's your mother, Dad. She's my grandmother. You uninvited her from Christmas because of a walker?" "Watch your tone, young lady," Patricia snapped, turning around with a sharp glare. "Your grandmother lives in a completely different world than the people coming to this house tonight. She worked as some low-level clerk in a government warehouse 40 years ago. She has nothing in common with board directors and international logistics managers. She would be completely out of her depth, and frankly, it would be embarrassing for your father." "Embarrassing?" Chloe whispered, her eyes filling with angry tears. "She's the sweetest person in this entire family. She bakes for the neighbors. She listens to me when I talk." "That is enough," David commanded, pointing a finger toward the stairs. "Go up to your room, put on your formal dress, and get ready. Mr. Harrington will be here in 2 hours, and I will not have you ruining this evening with a teenage attitude." Chloe glared at her father, her jaw trembling. She turned on her heel and stormed up the stairs, slamming her bedroom door shut. Downstairs, David took a slow sip of his coffee, his eyes tracking the cold winter sunlight through the floor-to-ceiling windows. He felt a sharp, tiny pang of guilt in his chest, but he quickly pushed it down. "It's for the best," David told himself, smoothing down his collar. "She's happier at home anyway. She doesn't like loud noise." What David failed to realize was that 10 miles away, in a quiet, immaculate frame house on Willow Street, Eleanor Vance was not sitting in confusion or helplessness. She was standing in front of her bedroom mirror, wearing a pristine navy blue dress, her silver hair pinned back into a flawless, professional bun. On her nightstand lay an unopened white envelope postmarked from the Pentagon that had arrived 6 days ago, an envelope that David had thrown straight into the junk pile when he last visited her house, never bothering to read the official seal on the front. By 7 o'clock that evening, the Vance mansion was humming with the refined, subdued noise of high society luxury. A string quartet played softly near the grand piano in the living room. 30 guests, wealthy corporate executives, local developers, and elite neighbors glided across the heated marble floors, holding crystal flutes of vintage champagne. Patricia was in her element. She moved through the crowd like a queen, accepting compliments on the gold leaf decorations, the catered prime rib, and the custom ice sculpture shaped like the company's corporate emblem. "Oh, thank you, Victoria," Patricia laughed delicately, tapping her glass against a neighbor's flute. "Yes, David and I designed the entire layout ourselves. We wanted something that felt clean, modern, and completely unencumbered by clutter." David stood near the marble fireplace, his knuckles white as he gripped his drink. He kept glancing at his watch. 7:15 p.m. Suddenly, the heavy double front doors were opened by the hired butler. A murmur traveled through the foyer as the guests parted ways. Stepping into the house was Richard Harrington. At 65 years old, Harrington looked like a man carved out of solid granite. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with steel gray hair, sharp dark eyes, and a commanding posture that instantly drew the energy of the entire room toward him. He wore a tailored charcoal suit, and pinned neatly to his left lapel was a small, silver pin shaped like a pair of crossed rifles over a shield. Behind him walked two junior executives carrying leather briefcases. David's heart hammered against his ribs. He immediately set his drink down on a passing server's tray and practically sprinted across the foyer, his face locked in a broad, desperate smile. "Mr. Harrington," David exclaimed, extending his hand with deep reverence. "Welcome, sir. Welcome to our home. Merry Christmas." Harrington stopped, looking down at David's outstretched hand. He offered a firm, brief handshake, his eyes scanning David's face with cool, assessing precision. "David," Harrington said, his voice deep, gravelly, and echoing with natural authority. "Thank you for the invitation. Apologies for the delay. Traffic on the interstate was backed up due to the snowstorm." "Oh, please, sir, don't apologize at all," Patricia chimed in, rushing to David's side and extending her hand with a dazzling, rehearsed smile. "Mr. Harrington, I am Patricia. It is an absolute honor to have you in our home. May I take your coat?" "My driver took it at the door, thank you," Harrington said politely. He stepped into the main living room, his sharp eyes moving across the vaulted ceilings, the gold decorations, the crystal chandeliers, and the long, immaculate dining table set for 20 guests. David hovered beside him like a nervous shadow. "We've prepared a private seating area for you at the head of the main table, sir. We have a sea-aged Cabernet brought in specifically from California, and the catering staff." Harrington held up a single, large hand, cutting David off mid-sentence. The CEO looked around the opulent room, a slight frown tugging at the corner of his mouth. He looked back at David, his eyebrows pulling together. "David," Harrington asked, his voice quiet but sharp, "where is she?" David blinked, caught completely off guard. I'm sorry, sir? Where is who?" "Your mother," Harrington said simply, his dark eyes locking onto David's with intense focus. "Where is Colonel Eleanor Vance?" David's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The air in his throat seemed to freeze solid. Beside him, Patricia's dazzling smile instantly shattered into a look of sheer, unadulterated confusion. My mother?" David stammered, his voice dropping an octave into a squeak. "Sir, I think there's been a mistake. My mother's name is Eleanor, yes, but she's not a colonel. She was just an administrative worker, a civilian clerk." Harrington stared at David for 3 long, agonizing seconds. The silence between the three of them grew so thick that the sound of the nearby string quartet seemed to echo like thunder. Harrington's eyes narrowed, a cold, dangerous glint flashing within them. "An administrative clerk?" Harrington repeated, his tone dropping into a low, terrifying rumble. "Are you telling me, David, that you do not know who your own mother is?" The floor beneath David's feet felt like it was beginning to sway. Several nearby guests, including 2 board members from Sterling Defense, stopped talking, their eyes turning toward the awkward exchange happening near the fireplace. "Mr. Harrington," Patricia squeaked out, trying desperately to regain control of the room, "I think you must have Eleanor confused with someone else. David's mother is 70 years old. She lives in a tiny frame house on the east side of town. She's quite frail, sir. She has a walker, she moves very slowly, and frankly, she doesn't do well in corporate environments." Harrington turned his gaze slowly toward Patricia. The look in his eyes was so cold, so heavy with quiet fury, that Patricia instinctively took a half step back, her breath catching in her throat. "Frail?" Harrington whispered. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a leather-bound military dossier stamped with a gold Department of Defense seal. He didn't open it, he simply held it in his hand, his knuckles white against the leather. 32 years ago, Harrington said, his voice echoing clearly across the hushed living room, during Operation Desert Storm, I was a 24-year-old first lieutenant leading a reconnaissance platoon in the Al Salman district of southern Iraq. The entire room fell into a dead silence. The string quartet, sensing the shift in the air, stopped playing. Guests turned from the bar, holding their glasses, listening intently. Our light-armored vehicle was struck by an anti-tank missile, Harrington continued, his voice steady as granite, yet laced with an old, deep emotion. 2 of my men were killed instantly. The driver and I were trapped inside the burning wreckage, pinned beneath crushed steel, surrounded by enemy mortar fire. The evacuation team refused to land because the LZ was heavily hot. Harrington took a step closer to David, staring down into the younger man's pale, trembling face. One medical evacuation helicopter defied direct orders to turn back, Harrington thundered softly. The pilot landed 30 yards from the burning wreckage. A female chief warrant officer unbuckled her harness, stepped out into a hail of small arms fire with nothing but a sidearm, and ran straight into the flames. David's chest was heaving. He couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. She used a hydraulic cutter to shear through the steel door, Harrington said, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. When a mortar shell exploded 20 feet away, spraying jagged shrapnel across the sand, she threw her own body over mine to shield my chest. She sustained 3 severe spinal fractures and deep shrapnel wounds to her hip. Harrington pointed a thick finger directly at David's chest. She refused medical evacuation until every single living soldier was loaded onto that chopper first. She spent 14 months in spinal rehabilitation, rebuilt her body through pure, unyielding discipline, and went on to serve another 15 years as one of the highest-ranking female logistics commanders in the United States Army Medical Regiments. Patricia looked like she was about to faint. She gripped the back of a plush sofa to steady herself, her eyes wide with terror. When I took over Sterling Defense 5 years ago, Harrington said, his voice trembling with a mixture of reverence and cold anger, I searched military records for 4 years to find the woman who saved my life and gave me the chance to raise my children. 2 weeks ago, the Pentagon confirmed her location right here in this city. I sent an official invitation to present her with the National Distinguished Civilian Service Medal at a private ceremony tonight. Harrington looked at the lavish spread, the ice sculpture, the white velvet tablecloths, and then looked directly into David's eyes. I accepted your dinner invitation, David, Harrington spat out, for one reason and one reason only. Because I believed I was coming to the home of a loving son who was celebrating Christmas with a national hero. Harrington looked around the room, his voice ringing out loud and clear for every wealthy guest to hear. Where is she, David? Why is her chair not at the head of this table? David stammered, tears of sheer humiliation bursting into his eyes. Mr. Harrington! I didn't know. She never told us. She never talked about the war. She didn't talk about it because true heroes don't brag to shallow people, Harrington barked. Now answer my question. Where is Colonel Vance? David swallowed hard, his throat dry as sandpaper. She's at home, sir, in her house. Why? Harrington demanded, his voice slicing through the room like a razor. Why is she at home on Christmas Eve? David couldn't speak. He looked down at the marble floor, completely destroyed. Patricia, panic taking over her brain, blurted out the truth before she could stop herself. Because we thought she'd be too much trouble. We thought the walker, and the space, and her age, would ruin the aesthetic for the corporate board. A collective gasp echoed through the room. Several of David's colleagues covered their mouths. 2 female board members looked at Patricia with expressions of absolute disgust and horror. Harrington stared at Patricia for 3 seconds. He didn't yell. He didn't scream. The look of utter, profound contempt on his face was far worse than any rage. Too much trouble, Harrington whispered softly. A woman who carried dying men through burning steel, was too much trouble for your cocktail party. Harrington turned on his heel, reaching into his pocket for his cell phone. I am leaving this house right now. My driver will take me to Willow Street, and I will spend my Christmas Eve honoring a real leader. Mr. Harrington, please, David begged, running after him, his hands outstretched in desperation. Please, I made a mistake. A terrible mistake. Let me call her. Let me go get her. Touch my arm again, David, and you won't have a job in this industry by midnight, Harrington warned coldly, pushing David's hand away. Harrington raised his phone to his ear. Captain Miller, bring the staff car to the front doors immediately. We are changing locations. Before Harrington could finish his sentence, a sudden, heavy sound rang out through the grand entrance hall. The doorbell rang. The sharp, loud, echoing chime vibrated through the high ceilings of the mansion, silencing the entire room instantly. Everyone froze. David stopped in his tracks, his breath catching in his lungs. Patricia stared at the front door, as if a ghost were standing on the other side. Harrington lowered his phone, his sharp eyes turning slowly toward the heavy mahogany entrance. Outside, through the frosted glass panels flanking the doorway, red and blue lights flickered brightly against the falling snow, casting long, dramatic geometric shadows across the white marble foyer. David stammered, looking at the butler, who stood frozen near the hallway. Who is that? Is that a police escort? Harrington didn't wait for the butler. He marched across the foyer, grabbed the heavy brass handle of the front door, and pulled it wide open. Standing on the snow-covered porch was an active-duty United States Army color guard. 4 young soldiers in crisp dress blue uniforms, holding the American flag and the Army regimental banner, their white gloves stark against the winter dark. Standing beside them was a 2-star Major General, his coat adorned with silver stars that caught the flash of the emergency lights parked in the driveway. And standing right in the center of the porch, wrapped in a simple, elegant navy blue wool coat, holding her silver cane with calm, unshakable poise, was 70-year-old Eleanor Vance. Beside her stood her granddaughter, Chloe, holding her grandmother's arm with a look of fierce, triumphant pride. The entire ballroom gasped. David's knees buckled so violently, he had to reach out and grab the entryway archway to keep from collapsing onto the floor. "Mom?" David breathed out, his voice cracking into a ragged whisper. Eleanor didn't look at David. Her clear blue eyes moved past him, locking onto the tall, silver-haired CEO standing in the doorway. Major General Thomas, standing beside Eleanor, stepped forward and snapped his right hand to his eyebrow, delivering a razor-sharp military salute to Richard Harrington. "General Harrington!" the Major General spoke out, his voice carrying clearly across the snow-filled air into the warm foyer. "We have escorted Colonel Eleanor Vance to this address as requested by the Department of the Army." Richard Harrington didn't salute back right away. Instead, the powerful, multi-billionaire CEO took 3 slow steps forward, out onto the snowy porch. He stopped right in front of Eleanor. Slowly, deliberately, Richard Harrington brought his heels together with a sharp, heavy click. He raised his right hand to his brow, holding a rigid, perfect, tear-filled salute to the elderly woman holding the silver cane. "Colonel Vance," Harrington said, his voice thick with raw emotion. "Permission to report, ma'am." Eleanor offered a faint, warm smile. Slowly, she raised her right hand, the same hand that had sewed the patchwork quilt, and returned the salute with perfect, disciplined posture. "At ease, Richard," Eleanor said softly, her voice steady and gentle. "It's good to see you standing on your own 2 feet." Tears welled up in Harrington's eyes as he lowered his hand and took both of Eleanor's hands in his own, bowing his head in deep reverence. "I've searched for you for years, Colonel," Harrington choked out. "I brought the Pentagon delegation to honor you tonight." Behind them, Chloe stepped forward, holding her grandmother's arm tightly. David rushed out onto the porch, his face streaked with tears, his hands shaking uncontrollably. "Mom! Mom, oh my God! Mom, I'm so sorry, I didn't know! I swear to God I didn't know!" Patricia hurried out behind him, her eyes wide with desperate, frantic terror as she saw the Major General, the color guard, and her husband's CEO all surrounding the woman she had locked out hours earlier. "Eleanor," Patricia cried out, her voice high and fake, her hands clasping together in a desperate plea. "Eleanor, darling, oh thank goodness you're here. Please, come inside. Come inside right now. Look, we have the head table ready for you. We'll move the ice sculpture. We'll clear the whole room. Please, sit at the center table with Mr. Harrington." Eleanor slowly turned her head to look at her daughter-in-law. There was no anger in Eleanor's eyes. There was no bitterness, no desire for vengeance, no loud rage. There was only a cold, crystalline clarity that hit Patricia harder than a physical blow. "No thank you, Patricia," Eleanor said softly, her voice carrying an unshakable dignity that commanded the attention of every person standing on that porch and inside that grand foyer. "Mom, please!" David sobbed, dropping to his knees on the cold, snowy stone of the porch, grabbing the hem of Eleanor's coat. "Please forgive me. I was an idiot. I was so focused on the promotion, on the money, on the house. I didn't realize who you were." Eleanor looked down at her son kneeling in the snow. "That is the tragedy, David," Eleanor said, her voice dropping into a gentle, heartbreaking sadness. "You shouldn't have had to know I was a colonel to treat me like your mother." David froze, his tears halting as Eleanor's words pierced straight into his soul. "You didn't leave me sitting alone in my house tonight because you didn't know about my medals," Eleanor continued quietly, looking into David's eyes. "You left me home because you thought I was just a weak, old woman who had outlived her usefulness to your image. You thought my walker was an embarrassment. You thought my age was too much trouble." Patricia opened her mouth to speak, but Eleanor raised a single gloved hand, cutting her off completely. "Honor isn't something you display on a marble table to impress rich guests, Patricia," Eleanor said, looking at her daughter-in-law. "Honor is how you treat the people who loved you when you had nothing." Eleanor reached into her large wool bag and pulled out the neatly wrapped patchwork quilt, tied with its red ribbon. She handed it gently down to David, who sat trembling in the snow. "I made this for your family," Eleanor said softly. "It's made from old scraps of clothes, some from my military duffel, some from your childhood baby blankets. It's warm, David, but it only works if the house inside is warm too." Eleanor turned to her granddaughter. "Chloe, sweetie, would you like to come with Grandma tonight? The Major General and Richard have invited us to the Veterans Center downtown. They're serving hot chocolate, playing real music, and spending the night with people who know what family actually means." "I'd love to go with you, Grandma," Chloe said, wiping a tear from her cheek and smiling brightly. She didn't even look back at her parents as she stepped down the porch stairs beside Eleanor. Richard Harrington turned to look down at David, who was still kneeling in the snow, clutching the patchwork quilt to his chest. "David," Harrington said, his voice cold, final, and absolute. "Your application for senior vice president is officially denied. Furthermore, the board will be reviewing your management contract on Monday morning. Sterling Defense does not employ leaders who abandon their own." Harrington offered his arm to Eleanor, helping her carefully down the 3 stone steps to the waiting sedan. The honor guard opened the door, standing at rigid attention as Colonel Eleanor Vance stepped inside the warm vehicle. As the heavy black sedan pulled away down the driveway, its taillights casting a red glow over the pristine white snow, David and Patricia stood alone on the grand porch of their $6 million mansion. The elite corporate guests inside were already grabbing their coats, leaving the party in silent disgust, leaving the untouched champagne flutes and the catered prime rib sitting cold on the marble tables. David sat on the cold stone porch in his cashmere sweater, holding his mother's handmade quilt against his chest, listening to the echoing silence of his hollow, picture-perfect home, realizing too late that in trying to hide the mother he thought was too much trouble, he had lost the only real honor he ever had.